Greetings all. Thank you very much for joining us for the screening of Brilliant Noise and Nostalgia for the Light. I'm Adam Hyman with Los Angeles Film Forum, and we're delighted to be able to have the artists of Semiconductor here for a conversation. This is pre-recorded, but I'm very happy to be able to welcome Ruth Jarman and Joe Gerhardt from the
Hi.
UK.
Hi.
And we'll just do a few questions to hopefully help you make to find the film Brilliant Noise a little bit more enrapturing. I find it just amazing and quite an experience on a larger screen. And I hope that you all in the audience did so as well. But linking it to some of the themes that we're concerned about in our overall series about imaging and imagining knowledge in film, I wanted to start by asking Joe and Ruth how you even came to learn about the imagery that you used in this film, like what were its sources?
We we were invited to do a residency at the Space Science Lab, Berkeley, and this was our first time that we had done a residency, like a fully immersive residency in a science lab. We didn't have any science background, and we sort of wanted to jump in the deep end. And so at the Space Science Lab, they're actually doing real science in space rather than astronomy, where they will make experiments that go on satellites. They'll do real measurements and look at stuff that's within our solar system. So they're looking at the sun and planetary magnetic fields and things like that. And so nearly every scientist that we would talk to, introduce ourselves to, would have one or two pictures of the sun, these black and white grainy images in their cubicles. And we would ask them, what are those? Tell us about that. And eventually we realized that there was whole archives of these available online. And even that was a novelty back then. So we made the film back in 2006. So it's nearly 20 years old. And so the whole idea of having access to archives through the internet was actually quite novel to us at that point.
So actually that raises a thing in your answer that I'm curious about. You said you didn't come to this with science background. So what was your background?
Well, we both studied fine art, but we both had this interest in kind of matter and the physical environment around us and how we as humans experience that. So we were both coming to making our kind of very individual art practices with those ideas, very similar ideas in mind. And at some point, we started to think about matter and events and processes in the physical world that happen beyond the limits of our experience. So the things that we don't directly see. And so what we've become really interested in doing is, by spending time in science labs, we get to look at this matter, but through the tools and the technology that science and technologies have developed as a way for us to extend our perceptions. And so we're interested, as you'll see, like in Brilliant Noise, in working with all the artifacts and errors and noise that come with developing technologies and with science that kind of interfere with how we experience this physical matter, but also reflect on kind of the limits of who we are as humans and how we experience the physical world.
Its title is referring to all the cosmic radiation, which is these clouds of noise that you see. So normally we're used to with NASA images, which are colourful and cleaned up and glossy and high resolution. And these black and white grainy cubical images that we discovered had this otherworldly sort of ancient photography quality. They looked like something from 1900. So we wanted to keep all that noise in there. And as soon as you started seeing time lapses of one image after the other, you could see that these are sort of clouds of solar radiation that the satellites are capturing. And so the film in a way is named after the stuff which is normally removed. And we were interested in how it tells you more about what's happening than the scientists need. So, science needs a kind of a clear, cleaned up answer, whereas all the noise of reality is normally removed from science. And for us to keep that in there was almost like we were putting it back.
Why do you think it's important for viewers to have opportunities to be cognizant of that noise?
Well, I think it's really important to have conversations about how science is there to ask questions and not necessarily give answers. So once you start to kind of break apart the kind of mechanisms that are used to kind of carry out science, it obviously helps people to kind of understand that a bit more. So instead of, say, having a very glossy NASA image, you know, very colourful, of kind of some nebula or something, and kind of going, wow, isn't that incredible, this beautiful, colourful image? When you start to understand that it's kind of been created from thousands of images and colorized and processed in this way, it helps you to start asking your own questions about maybe the process of science, or maybe kind of our place as humans, like in the larger universe.
But isn't that, and that's also, of course, one of the missions, if not the mission of art, right? To ask questions,
Yeah.
but not necessarily have answers.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, what we've learned from this process of being artists going into the science world and standing back from it is how naively we thought that science was giving us the answers, whereas it's really that's just how it's taught. Science is really just as much asking questions as the arts are, and so that's what, you know, we've always learned, have in common with science. It's just the way it's taught, the way you learn it in schools is just rows of facts, and of course you're never taught art that way. So for us, it was like learning science, going back to learning something that we never felt inspired by to learn at school, essentially, because of the way it was taught. If it had been taught in a more creative way, it would have had we'd have had a different, you know, upbringing in a way. So in a way, for us, it's, you know, we've been teaching ourselves science ever since, and you know,
Through the back door.
yeah, jumping in the deep end.
So a couple of specifics about imagery used in the film. What do you remember about the sources then, since it was 20 years, almost 20 years ago? Like the particularities of some of the sources of the imagery in that film. First of all, is everything in there of the sun?
Yes, everything is of the sun. So they're all photographs of the sun, but they're captured at different wavelengths. So that's why in different parts of the film, the sun looks different. And so when we first saw these black and white images, we were lucky that there were a couple of postdoc students that we persuaded them to help us access these archives. And they're probably easier to access these days, but at the time they were quite complicated, so we needed help going into the archives. And I think there was 7 kind of a mixture of ground-based and satellite observatories, and they'll all be observatories which have some kind of visual imaging device capturing the sun in some way. And so some of the data, I can tell you, I have a list here because I can never remember them all. So some of the data came from the Mount Wilson Observatory in UCLA, and we think the data that we worked with from there is at the end of the film, the final credit sequence. They're like images of these glass plates where somebody would sit and hand draw like the sunspots when they were observing them on the sun, and they were created in the 19th century. And then other archives with the Lascaux Soho archive. Then there's one called Trace, LMSAL, which was part of the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences. So that, yeah, so all there were kind of observatories that across the whole Earth, but often collaborations between different countries capturing the image data.
And you were in California for that period when working on that. Where was the residency again? Or
yes, the residency was at the Space Sciences Lab, and it's at the University of California in Berkeley. So we were living in Berkeley, so we were there for 6 months. literally going into the science lab every day, Monday to Friday, just being in the science lab. I mean, it was the most incredible experience because we kind of got deposited there. It was the first time we'd been into a science lab. So it was slightly terrifying on all levels, which we actually try to replicate now. We try to purposefully go into science labs fairly naive because we find that it enables us to have a journey which isn't driven by how they want to present science to you, that you can kind of, like we do this sort of going in the back door and learning about it from the ground up. So we end up with a very different kind of output than maybe they might want to share publicly, kind of. So yeah, so we spent 6 months there and we made several pieces of work while we were there. Some of them, other ones you can see on our website. Magnetic Movie was another moving image piece that we created. And we just had this incredible experience where the scientists put a lot of trust in us to kind of work with their science and their language and their data and make art.
So having found all these images of the sun work in different ways, do you remember how you came about organizing them? What was your editorial and audio approaches to how to organize and treat the visual?
Something about the actual accessing of the image, downloading them, because that was quite a
Yeah,
process.
I mean, at the time we just tried to get everything that we possibly could, which I think then there was such a limited amount of stuff available to get online. It was possible, but nowadays it wouldn't be. And we organized them mainly just around sections that were complementary. So it starts off with quite early footage from 1957, which is when, you know, the space race started. I think that's probably ground-based stuff, but you know, it shows you in some sense a bit of the history of looking at the sun at different stages. And most of the imagery is from a satellite, which is just looking at the sun in different wavelengths of light. So we would organize these into sections that would show different phenomena and lead you into understanding what you're looking at. So at the beginning, it's really hard to comprehend what's really going on. It's just quite abstract, but slowly it reveals more and more. I think nowadays people are much more familiar with this sort of imagery. Back then, it was kind of the first time people had really seen it. Even a lot of the scientists that had these pictures in their cubicles, they'd never really put animations together of the footage they were working on. So they could get all the information they needed for their scientific work just from one still. So it was even novel for them to see a whole film at the end of it. And they loved seeing artists present their own work back to them in a new light.
It helped us understand what we were doing, because actually at the end of that residency we then did a presentation to the scientists of like, oh, this is what we've discovered while we've been here, you know, this room full of rocket scientists, and we played them Brilliant Noise, and we just thought, well, this is ridiculous. This is what they're working on every day. We're like literally holding up a picture of what they do. But like Joe said, they hadn't ever sort of seen all these sequences brought together. And I guess maybe they wouldn't think that people would be interested in seeing that. And so on the one hand, they really seem to enjoy that kind of as a scientific kind of product, but also the fact that we were coming in and we were kind of celebrating what they did, because it becomes very everyday. You know, you're in a lab like that every day. You could be working sort of in a car mechanic workshop or something. It doesn't, you know, it's what you do and it's your world. But then we're coming along and saying, oh, this is amazing, this is brilliant. And it kind of reignites that excitement quite often.
I'm sure I should just mention a bit about how the sound was made. Sometimes we make sound and then we make image from the sound. Sometimes we make sound from the image. In this work, we're obviously making the sound from the image. So we're sampling the brightness to luminance, which is essentially what the scientists are doing. They're looking at the brightness of different wavelengths of light and using that to get a wave signal. We're using that wave of information to generate the soundtrack. So different pieces of frequencies and filters are listening to different bits of the image, and so that the image makes the sound. And of course, it's all based on the kind of noise of radio frequencies. So the sun actually does have sound. You can tune into it on the radio. It sends radio waves that you know, that that aren't in our audible frequency, of course. So there is sound in space if you listen in non-acoustic ways.
If you know where to tune in.
Yeah.
So actually, that's an interesting thing you just said. If not, how many of those images were generated, say, from the pre-digital time of astronomical image accumulation? How many are there? You talked about the glass slides being, and literally drawn by people looking through telescopes
Probably
at the
just the
sun with heavy
beginning.
filtration. But between
Yeah.
that and photographic representation, what percentage is that, and what others are other digital telescopes, radio telescopes?
Really, it's very much the stuff at the beginning and stuff at the end that really stand out. And all of the satellite imagery is very low quality. Because this satellite probably went up in the 90s and it was designed 10 years before that. So even that in a way is like, half a megapixel camera on a satellite or something. I mean, so I don't know.
I guess the satellite imagery will have been imaged and then transferred into data to be sent down. So how it would work is there'd be other instruments on the satellite as well as like a camera looking at the sun. And so all the data from all those different instruments gets sent down in one packet. And then we would have to extract the image from that packet. So we would get one image per day or something. And we'd have to do that for every image kind of we wanted to extract. So presumably that had kind of been compressed and then uncompressed and stuff. But I don't think, I think a lot of that was probably too early, wasn't it, to be digitized in the way that we know it today.
Yeah, well, it was compressed to be beamed back to Earth.
Yeah.
One particular moment that is always striking to me is just the sequence of the whole sun rotating, where you can see the whole thing. And I was just curious if you recall the origin of that. I assume it's some sort of time lapse per se, or just a series of photos of the full sun that you animated as a time lapse. But
yes,
call that.
Yeah, there are.
I have a feeling that came from the gong.
Yeah.
That from the gong and the National Solar Observatory archive. That's what I seem to remember.
Yeah.
But it's just that
there's a few times I think it could be talking about.
But then, obviously the scientists who sort of invest in these different observatories, they're interested in observing the sun for different reasons. So they're all trying to capture the information in different ways. And obviously that one's looking for like the whole solar effect, I guess, for kind of observing solar maximum and minimum, I should imagine, and observing the sunspots coming and going, rather than sometimes, when you have you're kind of close up and it seems like you have all this kind of plasma that suddenly does this thing where it flings like this. It's to do with the magnetic fields that suddenly break, and then the plasma kind of then shoots off the end of this magnetic field. So we did, when we were at the lab, we did learn an awful lot about magnetic fields and interplanetary magnetic fields.
Solar max at the moment, aren't we?
We are having and so we did kind of, we've kind of absorbed all this information, which is a lovely kind of byproduct of spending 6 months in a space sciences lab.
It is great to be able to like learn new things every 6 months or a year, while continually also being able to make your art, I would say.
It is, but I think quite often we're kind of delving into such particular parts of science that though that information that we absorb and learn is only ever useful for the artwork that we make. I don't think it can be applied to anything else. We recently, actually it was about 5 years ago now, we did a residency at CERN, and we made several works from coming out of there, and it's the same thing. We learn very particular information about a bit of hardware and a bit of scientific data, and I don't know, forget if it's very useful anywhere else.
Well, it creates, sort of magical imagery in my experience of your projects. But of course, that's its own sort of thing. It's like magical imagery, but it's a scientific imagery.
Yes.
reorganized, reconceptualized through an arts
Yeah.
prism
Yeah.
to ideally lead to at least moments to think about how we perceive and what we perceive.
Yes. Well, that's what we hope to achieve, that we're always sort of trying to work on that boundary of something being kind of almost familiar, you get to kind of, it's an unknown. So we're trying to kind of play with that kind of precipice between what we know and what we think we know and what we don't know, and try to kind of trick you in some ways into thinking you know what you're seeing, but you don't.
So,
Something like that.
yeah, well, that I think gives us what we would like to hear. Now, I want to make sure everybody in the audience knows that you have another piece in the city as part of Pacific Standard Time, and that is at the Art Center College of Design in the
Yes.
Williamson Gallery there. And just if you want to tell us, give a sense or two about that installed piece.
Yeah, so the work we're showing there is called Spectral Constellations, and it's a physical artwork on these 3 LED panels, and they're playing a generative animations which we have created using data which is captured by scientists who are collecting light from distant balls of gas and dust that potentially might one day turn into planets and solar systems. And so, yeah.
So hopefully everybody
actually the exhibition opens tonight. It's opening while this screening's taking place, coincidentally.
Oh, so hopefully some people in this audience checked that out and then came over here to video
Yeah.
to watch the film. That would be the perfect mix. But I believe that exhibition is up in the Williamson Gallery there, up on the hill. It's the hill version of Art Center as opposed to the city center version of Art Center. And it's up through February. So hopefully all of you can make time. And then a good number of Semiconductor's pieces are available for viewing, I believe, on through your website, through your Vimeo page. And so we hope all of you will take time and check some of that out. We find their work to be just really smashing, as they say. So with that, I want to thank Joe and Ruth for taking a few minutes with us today. And we hope you all enjoyed the show and this conversation.
Great. Thanks very much. Bye.